This is the second video in a two-part series describing the tissues you'll observe in Lab Exercise 3. The first video observes epithelial tissue, and the second video looks at connective tissue. With connective tissue characteristics, you'll find that this is very different from epithelium. With epithelial tissue, you are examining the epithelial cells and their close proximity with one another to identify each tissue type. However, with connective tissue, you find that the hallmark is actually extracellular, outside the cell, in what's called an extracellular matrix. Here you're going to see ground substance made of proteins and large amounts of water, which just look like clear space. The three types of protein you'll look at here are collagenous fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Collagenous fibers are made of collagen and are very tough and strong. While they are white in a living specimen, they look pink when stained for slides. Elastic fibers are going to be made of the protein elastin, and they allow tissue to recoil once it's been stretched. In your slides, they appear thin and black. And reticular fibers, also appearing thin and black, are made of collagen, and they tend to provide framework for organs. In addition to the differences here with connective tissue, you'll find that the cells are very diverse. You're going to see fibroblasts, macrophages, leukocytes, mast cells, and adipocytes, so make sure you can identify those types of cells within each connective tissue type. When you look at connective tissue, you'll see different categories here. Within connective tissue proper, you see loose groupings of loose areolar, loose adipose, and loose reticular connective tissues. You'll also see dense connective tissues that are broken down into dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and what's known as elastic tissue. Another group is known as cartilage. You'll look at hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage before moving on to bone connective tissue, which is going to be including compact bone and spongy bone. Finally, you'll end with blood connective tissue. We're going to start with our analysis of connective tissue proper, looking at loose areolar connective tissue. So at 400x magnification, you can see here the individual fibroblasts, which are the cell that's most predominant in this first slide. It has a dark oval nucleus and a long fibroblast shape right over here that looks like a tapered end on either side. Again, the nucleus is what stains the most darkly here, and so that's what you tend to see more of as you look throughout the slide. The fibroblasts are named because they are producing protein fibers, visualized here in pink as collagen fibers, and in thin black lines as elastic fibers. Again, note the fact that the cells are all very spread out and that there's a lot of open space in this tissue. This is a great example of what connective tissue, loose connective tissue, is going to look like. When you look at a second slide for areolar connective tissue, you'll find that it's stained specifically to show you a different cell known as mast cells. So in this tissue, you're still going to see fibroblasts, all through here, with their skinny nuclei, and pink collagen fibers, and black elastic fibers. But in addition to that, the mast cells stand out because of their dark round nuclei, surrounded by a cluster of black granules. And that's what your mast cells are going to look like. They're important because they release chemicals associated with inflammation. Areolar connective tissue can also be found when you go back and look at your skin slides. You'll recall that the epidermis here was made of epithelium, and just below it you had a papillary layer of the dermis. And this papillary layer is made of areolar connective tissue. We move on then to adipose connective tissue, also considered one of the loose types of connective tissue. And adipose is also known as fat. The individual cells here are known as adipocytes, right, or fat cells. Like all the cells we see, they have nuclei, but the nuclei are squished here along the outside wall of the cell. The cells are primarily used to store fat in what are known as inclusions, and so here you see that that fat is stored as an oil droplet inside the cell, more or less pushing the organelles, like the nucleus, up against the wall. And that's what causes that nucleus to look flattened. I've always thought that this looked like eyeballs here with your white space in the sagittal section of the eyeball, and then that nucleus looks a little bit like an iris. This is adipose connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue here is going to be highlighted by the presence of dark black reticular fibers. If you look through the slide, you'll see that it looks like there are spikes that run from the surfaces of the cells all throughout the tissue. And those are the reticular fibers which weave all throughout the organ itself. Again, providing a really strong framework to build a fibrous organ and to allow blood vessels to pass through without being damaged when that organ moves. Here you're going to see fibroblasts by denoting their dark nuclei. Once again, these are the cells responsible for producing all those dark black reticular fibers. As you move into dense connective tissues, you start with dense regular. So once again, you can see fibroblast cells. Here their nuclei are very thin, right? But again, they are fibroblasts, so their job is to produce protein fibers. The most abundant type here in this tissue are collagen fibers, shown in pink. Right? So the idea here is that these pink collagen fibers tend to lay in more or less parallel lines. They almost look like waves running throughout this tissue. And so dense regular, indicating the parallel nature of the collagen fibers. We can contrast this with dense irregular connective tissue. Once again, going back to a skin slide. Your dense irregular connective tissue is best found in the reticular layer of the dermis. As you zoom into the reticular layer, you can still see pink bundles of collagen fibers, but instead of running in parallel waves, these now run in multiple different directions. So dense irregular versus dense regular. The next kind of dense tissue is elastic connective tissue. Here you're looking at the wall of the aorta, a very thick blood vessel, and all of these black fibers that you can see running through the wall of this aorta are all elastic fibers, once again providing recoil whenever this vessel is stretched open. As you zoom into 400x magnification, you get a much better view of these dark black fibers weaving their way all the way around the perimeter of the vessel itself. You move then into the three types of cartilage connective tissue, starting first with hyaline. As you look at hyaline cartilage, you begin to see characteristics of all three types of tissue. First off, you find that these types of tissue are going to be pretty abundant in protein fibers. Hyaline cartilage is most abundant with collagen, and so it does appear pink in color. Now, as you zoom more closely, you're going to be looking at a unique cell morphology made up of cells called chondrocytes, which sit inside of lacunae. If you zoom into those, you can see that basically what you see is a darkly staining nucleus of a chondrocyte inside of a hollow fluid-filled bubble, which is a single lacuna. And so these are going to be situated all throughout the tissue itself, chondrocytes in lacunae. Hyaline cartilage is going to be bordered by a region known as the perichondrium, peri meaning around, chondrium meaning cartilage, so perichondrium. As you move to the next type, you see elastic cartilage connective tissue. So here you can see that it's still going to have this border of perichondrium on either side of the cartilage itself. As you look here, you see that the cells also have the chondrocytes, right? Or cells are chondrocytes, and that they are set inside of these little fluid-filled bubbles known as lacunae. Zooming in gives you a better view of this. There's the chondrocyte itself inside of that hollow lacuna. Now, the reason this tissue looks black or dark blue is because the most abundant protein are the elastic fibers. So we say it's an elastin-rich matrix in between all of the chondrocytes here. The last type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. And what you can see here is a section of the pubic symphysis. This is where the two pubic bones come together anteriorly. So what you're actually seeing here is going to be part of one pubic bone, and this is the other pubic bone. And where they're joined in the middle in this pink strip is going to be the location of fibrocartilage. So here you're looking at a zoomed image. You can see the bone of the pubic bone right over here. We'll study this tissue in a second. And here you can see the fibrocartilage on this side. Note once again, very characteristically, you're going to see chondrocytes within lacuna. One thing you'll notice here that's unique is fibrocartilage does not have perichondrium. And so you don't have a thick strip of perichondrium dividing the fibrocartilage from the spongy bone. Instead, it looks like one just runs right into the other. So the next group of slides we look at are bone tissue. So moving right off from that fibrocartilage, you would have seen spongy bone, and here we zoom into that spongy bone to give you a better idea. What's interesting about bone tissue is that it actually forms from cartilage in many places. And so you're going to see a lot of similarities here in morphology when compared to hyaline cartilage. When you look at spongy bone, you can see why it gets its name. It does look like it's porous, much like a sponge. And so the structure that you see here, the bone in itself is arranged in trabeculae, or little ridges that run all through the bone itself. As you take a closer look at this, you'll see that this is actually very compressed collagen fibers, and it still looks like it retains that cellular property of the chondrocytes in lacuna. However, as you zoom in, you find that these are not chondrocytes making cartilage, these are osteocytes, so bone cells. So these are bone cells in spongy bone, still housed in lacuna. All those porous regions that are out to the side then are a combination of two types of tissue primarily. You'll see adipocytes with their very characteristic light bubble appearance, but then you'll also see hematopoietic cells, also known as hemopoietic cells, and these are blood cells. So many people know that bones contain red bone marrow, and it's these hematopoietic cells that make up that red bone marrow. The second kind of bone you look at is compact or ground bone. And so here you can see it's compact because you don't have those porous spaces you saw with spongy bone. Instead, you see a really characteristic appearance here that looks like trees with tree rings or like records. Compact bone is arranged into functional units known as osteons, and this would be a single osteon here. This would be a neighboring osteon. And the anatomy of each has a central canal right there of the osteon with rings known as concentric lamella that go all the way around. This is not the only kind of lamella you see in bone. You see interstitial lamella between osteons, and if we were zoomed out, we'd also see circumferential lamella going all the way around the bone itself. As you zoom into a single osteon here, you once again see the central canal, but then making up these concentric lamella inside, you find that layered around them are osteocytes in lacuna. So this is very similar to what we saw in cartilage with chondrocytes in lacuna, as well as what we saw in spongy bone with osteocytes in lacuna. You'll also notice here that there are canaliculi, tiny canals, which run from these neighboring osteocytes, allowing them to communicate with one another. The final type of connective tissue you look at is blood. So blood is considered connective tissue because of that wide spread nature of the tissue itself. And of course, this clear space you see is technically plasma, so the watery portion of your blood. You can think of this as the extracellular matrix of blood connective tissue. And running with the characteristics of connective tissue, there's a diverse type of cells. The most predominant cells you see are erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells, unique because they actually lack a nucleus. So you see a hollow white space in the cells instead of a nucleus that's darkly staining. You also see leukocytes, known as white blood cells. They stain purple on these slides, and they have really unique groupings of dark nuclei. Finally, you'll see an element known as a platelet. This is a cellular fragment, not a true whole cell, but they're very small, and you tend to find them dispersed all throughout the plasma, just kind of embedded around all of the erythrocytes. As with epithelial tissues, with every one of these, you want to make sure you can tell us the name of the tissue type, including that it's connective tissue in your identification. For your quiz, all you need to do is tell us the name of the tissue, but on the practical, you should be prepared to tell us all bolded terms from the lab manual and all labeled components of each histology image.